Alright, what's up everybody? Today's going to be a fun episode. We're doing overrated or underrated. If you ever want to participate in a future episode, just follow me on Instagram. It's basement.bodybuilding. Keep an eye out for my stories because that's where I always post the polls for these hot takes or Q&A videos. Before I get into the first take, I wanted to give a shout out to Boostcamp. Boostcamp has all of my programs, both paid and free. If you want to check out any of my paid programs, just download the app through the link in my description. Use the code BASEMENT. You can access any of my paid programs for free for 2 weeks. Give it a shot. They're all fundamentally sound, great programs for hypertrophy. No gimmicks, no BS or anything. They're great stuff that it's similar to what you see me run on this channel. I also want to give a shout out to Barbell Apparel. If you want to check out any of the clothes that I wear in my videos, check the link in my description to shop my entire collection. With that said, let's get into the first topic for today. So the first one is super deep range of motion is overrated and a lengthened biased resistance profile is underrated. So if you've been following my channel for a bit, you'll know I generally tend to agree with this, based on the video that I posted last year about super deep range of motion not always being the way to go. It was that video in particular was about going for that super deep stretch at the expense of everything else is usually a bad idea. You want to pick and choose when you're going for that deep stretch. You want the lift to make sense going for the deep stretch from a mechanical perspective and from a resistance profile perspective. The example I used in that video was the incline dumbbell press. Once you get below parallel, at a certain point, the tension just becomes so minimal that you'll actually start to lose some tension on your pecs. The dumbbells will start to track inwards, and then when you're pressing back up, it gets a little bit awkward to press in that particular path. What I would say here is the better way to go about this is actually just to go back to a phrase that does sound quite gimmicky in the fitness industry these days, but I think has a lot of truth to it. And it's actually just keeping constant tension on the working muscle. A lot of people will kind of conflate this with time under tension, and I'm not necessarily a huge advocate of time under tension, since I think ultimately it just comes down to your proximity to failure, but challenging that target muscle to actually reverse direction from the eccentric into the concentric makes a ton of sense. And trying to chase a stretch and go for a super deep range of motion when one, the stretch is going to be minimal, and two, when it's a mid or short resistance profile, when you have to go up into that crazy ascending resistance profile, I don't think it makes a whole ton of sense. And I think that's why you see a lot of people with big jacked muscles do kind of like partial reps on resistance profiles that are mid-biased. So that's generally my thoughts here. I do think that super deep ranges of motion is overrated, or they are overrated rather, when you don't know when is the best place to do them. And a lot of the time, people just aren't going based on feel, they're just being dogmatic about something that somebody said on Instagram. As far as the lengthened biased resistance profiles, I think those are underrated. I think people got too caught up with the lengthened partials, which I think is a problem because when you're voluntarily ending your concentric, it's hard to put forth a maximum effort when you have to worry about stopping your concentric short. So when you have a lengthened biased resistance profile, you're putting all of that tension into that lengthened portion of that lift without having to voluntarily stop your concentric short. You can just power through all the way into a much easier short position, and that short position isn't going to limit you by adding a ton of fatigue or putting a ton of tension where your muscle isn't going to be very strong anyways, for example, a preacher curl. Next one, barbell rows equals underrated. Part of every pro's arsenal till 2020. If we're going to talk about a lift that had a major fall off in the fitness industry, I think the barbell row has to be it. It was like if you were to talk about the big three and then you asked if there was a fourth lift you would add to that, prior to 2020, the barbell row is fourth, maybe fifth, along with pull-ups, and it has definitely had its own fall from grace. And I think it just comes down to it's a weird hybrid lift, and it's very much program context dependent. So if your program is free weight squat and hinge heavy, you're going to have a tough time finding a spot for a barbell row. And ultimately, if you're using the barbell row strictly to target the upper back, you're not really getting a whole ton of extra benefit from just doing a barbell row instead of doing something like a chest-supported T-bar row instead, where you can actually save your spinal erectors that are already cooked, whether it was earlier that session or from yesterday, or they're getting cooked tomorrow in a heavy free weight squat or a hinge variation of choice. So they're a weird lift, but I think when used properly, they're quite underrated. And I think a lot of people do like to just throw the lift out altogether, but I think they are a really good lift when used properly. I actually used to be one of those people that I put the barbell row as one of the most overrated lifts, and I was kind of saying it in a not very nuanced way. And this is actually kind of what I started the channel. And I don't necessarily view the lift any differently, but I do think it has its own special utility, which would be it's basically an upper back biased hinge. So if you have your main hinge, say it's a stiff leg or a Romanian on your first pull or your leg day in your program, on your second one, a barbell row makes a ton of sense because you can actually get some stimulus to your entire posterior chain, but have it actually be a little bit more biased towards like the traps in the rear delt. So I think it has its time and place, and it's just a lift that requires, it has a specific utility, I would say. Next one, the deadlift is overrated. So this one is, it's tough to say exactly because deadlift is kind of an umbrella term. There's a ton of different variations. So if we're talking like a competitive deadlift for powerlifting, like a conventional or a sumo, or you're trying to maximize your leverages, I think it's one of the most overrated lifts out there. I don't see why you shouldn't just go for a stiff leg or a Romanian in the vast majority of cases if you're just training purely for hypertrophy. So I would say when it comes to a conventional or sumo, or basically a competition style deadlift, very much overrated. Like I used to deadlift over 600 pounds and my hamstrings always completely sucked because I was doing sumo. So I was just focused on the number and progressive overload and whatnot. Little did I know it's not actually doing what I wanted it to do. But look at me now where I'm doing like high 300s, low 400s for reps. I slashed a third of the weight off the bar, and my hamstrings are getting a much better stimulus these days. And I believe that if I was to get to like a 450 or so for reps with a very stiff leg controlled eccentric deadlift, my hamstrings would be much bigger than if I was deadlifting like 600-700 with like a sumo deadlift or something. So I would say conventional or competition style deadlifts are overrated, but bodybuilding, hypertrophy style deadlifts, like specifically the ones you're seeing me do in this video, which is a stiff leg, I do think they're quite underrated because they make your spinal erectors absolutely jacked and they kill your hamstrings and get you a good amount of glutes in the process. So from a hypertrophy perspective, it's a really, really, really good lift. Next one, stability is a bit overrated these days. Humans can actually brace a little bit to stabilize skill issues. So I would say, as far as rating stability goes, I think it's properly rated because I actually do think it is very important. I just think people don't fully understand what stability is, and it's used improperly a lot of the time, or it's used needlessly a lot of the time. Like people will try and get all these ultra stable variations for lifts that don't require external stabilization, or don't require this excess external stabilization, I should say. So if you're trying to do all these crazy things like use a wrist cuff or above the elbow so it's more stable and you don't have to worry about like your forearms giving out, I think that's absolutely absurd and makes zero sense, because that's just not a case where you would need any more stability. A wrist cuff is even borderline excessive for most people in the first place, even though it has its time and place, and I'm actually a pretty big fan of them. But if we're talking stability in terms of the strongest opposing force we could have, I think anybody that tries to say stability isn't important is just being disingenuous, because a lot of the people that hate on these fads like stability will say, oh, we'll stick to the basics, but they don't actually think about what the basics are. Okay, let's look at the basics. Squat, bench, deadlift. The strongest possible opposing force you can get across all three of those lifts. Like, they're not perfectly stable because there's a lot of joint exposure, but if we're talking about stability in terms of the strength of the opposing force, there's a reason why lifts that don't have a strong opposing force don't make it. There's a reason why they don't have that same reputation that lifts like the squat, bench, or deadlift have, and it's because they're not standardized. They don't have that crazy strong opposing force. So I think people are very hypocritical with this, and I am not afraid to call that out. I'm not going to name anybody in particular, but we pretty much all know who's obsessed with stability. We all know who is super anti-stability, and they're both super dogmatic. I'm somebody that just is recognizing patterns throughout history and knows that if we just apply those same stability principles to various lifts, they work really well. And shocker, when I do Smith machine JM presses and preacher curls, I got 18-inch arms because I applied the same principles that squat, bench, and deadlift have to lifts that would target muscles that I actually care to grow. Next one, overhead tricep work has become underrated again after being demonized. So I don't follow like the whole science-based crowd quite enough, but I do know people started to kind of hate on overhead extensions quite a bit because they like didn't target the long head or whatever. And if we're talking about skill issues, this is actually a case where it is kind of a skill issue. I think that if we're talking about just if I had to take 100 random lifters to do a study on, anywhere from beginner to intermediate level, I would say people would actually grow the long head of their triceps better doing something like a push down or even a JM press better than they would if they were to do an overhead extension. And the main reason for that is it is just going to be stability and overall mobility. When you're doing an overhead extension, it's very important that your elbow stays in position and your elbow stays up high. A lot of people think it's totally fine to just let your elbows flare out way to the side or flare out way in front, and it turns into more of a press than an extension. And they're going to say, like, well, it's only moving a little bit. Why does it really matter that much? And I would say because the long head of the tricep is competing against the lateral and medial heads. And at that point, if your elbows are tracking forwards and you're getting movement at the upper arm as you're extending, turning it into more of an extension and press hybrid overhead, at that point, you're just not getting a whole ton of long head because simply the lateral and the medial heads are just taking over. So at that point, what I would do is I would suggest, one, either clean up your technique and humble yourself and go lighter and actually keep your elbows high. Or if you don't have the mobility to do that, or you don't have the setup to do that with a short back stationary bench, I would say just do a setup that's a little bit more stable. Like an incline push down is excellent. Even a JM press, I think you can get decent long head growth from that, even though it's probably not the best choice for somebody that has like a lagging long head, or if it's like a super high priority or something. I would say at that point, an overhead extension is the way to go. But I think you get my points here. I'm going to stop the ramble right now. So next one, the stretch is overrated AF. I would say the stretch is pretty overrated. I think you can get, obviously, stretch-mediated hypertrophy, but that seems to be kind of a one-time thing that you just have to maintain once you have it in the first place. So I don't think it's like super crazy potent for growth or anything. I just think having a lot of tension when your muscle is lengthened is very important. And a lot of the time, when you're getting the biggest stretch possible, there's just very little tension in that scenario. So if you were to go like ATG squats or something like that, like you can kind of just hang out in the bottom. You're not actually getting that much tension in the stretch. So as long as it's a scenario where you're getting a stretch that also has a lot of tension and you're not just resting in the bottom and you actually have to work to reverse directions, I think that's fine. But a lot of the time, people are just looking for ways to make training easier, and they'll use the stretch as kind of a mask to make training easier when they think they lie to themselves and pretend that it's just a more potent lift because of the stretch, but they're just making it easier because they're resting in the stretch, but they don't think of the rest, they just think of the stretch. Next one from Ben the Barman, Steve Shaw. Overrated. Face pulls, underrated. So many rear delt exercise options I never see anyone doing. I do agree with this. I would say when it comes to face pulls, you don't want to be limited by your ability to externally rotate at the shoulder. And the problem with face pulls, one, there's no opposing force. So it's just your progression potential is very much limited unless you were just to add reps forever, which does get quite tedious and it's not very mentally stimulating for most people, I would say. But I would also say that when it comes to the rear delts, my two favorite rear delt lifts, nobody ever does. It's a lying rear delt raise. I think some people call them a Powell raise. These are very underrated. They're incredible for the rear delts. And I would also say a cable single arm reverse fly, which basically mimics the Powell raise, but you can do it standing if you prefer that. You saw me doing these in my last videos, B-roll. Super underrated. I think the crossbody is quite important for the rear delts. And I would say even if you want to go with something that's not unilateral, I would even say a reverse pec deck is the way to go because you don't have to do all this crazy rotation. You actually have an opposing force. And while it doesn't get you cross body, because it's bilateral and because of the machine setup, it's actually just still an excellent lift. So face pulls are okay. If somebody particularly likes them or it keeps their shoulders healthy, I'm totally fine with keeping in a program. But as far as rear delt growth goes, they are pretty far down on my list, actually. Next one, overrated full body workouts. At this point, I would say full body workouts are becoming overrated. I think at a certain point, it's too much to focus on if you want to maximize your entire physique. And while there are a lot of benefits that come with full body training, like the frequency, the amount of days off you can take throughout the week just to stay a bit more refreshed mentally. I think those are awesome. There are going to be its own drawbacks, and that's why I think trying to like put any split on a pedestal or something just really doesn't make any sense, because what one split does well, the another split just it what one split does well, it has its own drawbacks that allows for that the thing it does well, basically. I really explained that horribly. I'm not very proud of myself on that one, but you get what I'm saying. Every split is a double-edged sword, so how can one be better than another? Like, yeah, there's some that are generally preferred and some that generally aren't preferred, but this splits in general are overrated. So this whole fad about full body workouts are, it's a bit much in my opinion, even though it is a totally valid way to train. Next one, relentless pursuit of the basics and training with high intensity are way underrated. At this point, I actually would say they've become underrated. I've critiqued the basics quite a bit on this channel for a while, but I think at this point, it's almost they're almost too far gone. They're almost too underrated and overlooked. And I think that the problem with it is that we don't necessarily need to just be minimalists and stick to the basics. But there are so many good principles of the basics that we can just apply to more modern methods of training, which is what I try and do on this channel for the most part. So I think when you get these, you get these newer, younger lifters that really just completely disregard the basics and they just try and like reinvent the wheel in a way. But in reality, what you want to do is just expand on the wheel. You want to make better wheels. You don't want to make a completely different type of wheel. So I would also say, in addition to what you're saying here with high intensity is super underrated. People get way too caught up in the variables, and it's easy to forget that intensity and how hard you train is what matters most. Like, all the other stuff, those are the things we can manipulate and play around with and experiment with, but at a certain point it does become a distraction from intensity, which is the meat and potatoes of muscle growth along with technique. So yeah, I would say intensity it's tough because you can't really sell it. You can't really repeatedly discuss it because content creators are in a hamster wheel to always put out new information. So if you talk about the same thing over and over, nobody's going to listen to it. So you can't just continually talk about intensity. You can talk about it once, and then years go by, and as you get new viewers, they don't hear you talk about intensity. They kind of overlook it. But ultimately, when you look at all the biggest guys, the one common theme is they all train incredibly hard and they all have great technique. So intensity will always be underrated, and I find that it just has to click in somebody's head. You can tell them to train hard all you want. Everybody thinks they train harder than they do, but until they're inspired to train hard, they're not going to. So find a way to get inspired to train hard and you're good. Next one, overrated stability with science-based nerds, underrated compound movement. So we already talked about stability here, but I thought the compound movements portion was interesting here. I would actually say compound movements are pretty much properly rated. I think ultimately it just doesn't really matter all that much if a movement is single joint or multi-joint when it comes to training for hypertrophy. All that really matters are the progression potential, the stability, the resistance profile, and how much you like the lift, I think. So whether it's single joint or multi-joint, I just don't think it matters all that much, and I actually think viewing it from a total joints involved perspective doesn't really make a whole ton of sense once you understand the principles of stability and resistance profiles. Because when you don't quite get it, and maybe you're a beginner, telling them to stick to compound lifts can make sense because it gets them to do something that is a little bit more stable. But once you understand how stability works and how resistance profiles work, you can make a single joint lift follow the principles of a compound lift while doing a compound lift that follows the principles of what most kind of gimmicky single joint exercises follow. So if you were to take something like a preacher curl, for example, and I use this for every example, that follows all the same principles that something like a bench press or a squat or a deadlift follows, but it happens to be single joint. Or you could look at a multi-joint lift that just doesn't really follow any of those principles. So maybe something like a standing pinch plate press where you're like squeezing the two little plates together, and it's a compound lift because your wrists are moving, because your hands are flat, your elbows are moving, your shoulders are moving. So it's like the actual joints involved ultimately doesn't really matter all that much once you understand the principles of it. Next one, Smith machine squats are underrated, going to true failure with full stability. So I would say Smith machine squats are underrated, and it is a really good happy medium between something like a hack or a pendulum and a free weight barbell squat. I find that if we're trying to decide how much hip or knee we want involved in a particular squat, a Smith squat is a really good way to get a really quad bias squat without having the instability of a barbell squat in terms of hip support, because you can kind of use the barbell to counter that quite a bit if you're someone that doesn't have access to a pendulum or a hack. So I would say, just from personal experience and training clients, the Smith squat, just a good old Smith high bar squat, optional heel elevation, it's so much easier to control your hips and knees on that than it is a free weight barbell squat, just due to the bar being in a fixed path. So it's a really good way to get the exact proportions you want in terms of glutes versus quads, and you can actually get some spinal erector gains just a little bit in the process, because it is not a hip loaded, it is a upper back loaded variation. Next one, underrated, weighted dips as the main chest builder. So I would actually say weighted dips are a bit underrated as a main chest builder. I think when it comes to the pecs, you can just get a massive amount of range of motion at the pecs with a weighted dip. I'm not even purely just talking about the stretch, I'm just talking about the origin to the insertion. When you're talking about like a flat press or something, you are going to be relatively limited because obviously the bar is going to hit your pecs. But with a dip, you can go so deep. Your shoulders can elevate, and then they can pack down as you press, or you can just keep them depressed the whole time, which I generally prefer to do. But there's a ton of different ways to do it, and they're all going to hit your pecs hard as long as you aren't arching excessively on them. So underrated, I would say for sure. Weighted dips is the main chest builder. Next one, leg press is overrated. So I would disagree with this one. I think the leg press is probably the most incorrectly used tool in most bodybuilders' programs. The leg press it's like the jack of all trades and the master of all trades when it comes to just general leg development. If you do like a moderate stance height and width on a leg press, it's going to give you insanely big legs. Like if you do a leg press with a moderate stance height and a moderate stance width, like shoulder width maybe halfway up the foot plate, your glutes, quads, and adductors will be absolutely jacked. If you do seated ham curls and your favorite calf raise variation, like you can get such massive legs just doing that. And if you need more quads, you can go with a lower, narrower stance and your heels can come up a bit. And yeah, it's perfectly stable, insane progression potential. It has a great opposing force. The resistance profile is very solid. It's not lengthened bias, but it's a mid-range bias lift. It's easy to standardize your target range of motion if you want to go deep or you want to go just to be on 90 degrees of knee bend. It's incredible. I'm a massive leg press fan, and I just think I think people lack leg press identity, I would say. You have to know your technique, you have to know your stance, you have to know the back angle that you prefer and why. You have to know your depth. Like once you figure out what you want to get out of the leg press, it is an excellent tool that I do think is underrated. And let's see, the next one, hot take, power building is underrated for beginners and early intermediates. So you know me, I hate power building a ton. I think power building is a little bit overrated. It's funny because the fitness industry has changed so much over the past few years, but I would still say with power building, it has a time and a place. And for the person that is very timid and very afraid to add weight, and they want to make sure a weight feels light, or they're too kind of addicted or connected to the certain mind-muscle connection that they're getting from a very light weight on a certain lift, that person is going to benefit from power building, because power building itself, when done as intended, is going to be better than any gimmick out there, because it actually is a valid form of training. It's just not as good as actual proper hypertrophy training. So I would say when it comes to this approach, if you're like an overthinker or someone that's like kind of like modern science based, I would say power building is still probably a better option, as funny as it is for me to say that, just because it's at least letting you progress. But ultimately, it's just going to be a terrible version of what good bodybuilding should be. Next one, and actually this is the last one. Having preset volume is overrated for muscle building. If you know what you're going to do, you should be able to tell when you get enough stimulus. So yeah, I find that volume should be more of an outcome. There can be ranges to be recommended for volume, and I'm okay with that. So I'd say anywhere from like 6 to 15-ish sets a week, and 15 is even a little high, I would say, in the vast majority of cases. That is a reasonable approach. But if someone's telling you like you have to do X amount of volume and then you're reverse engineering your program to that, that doesn't make any sense at all, because then in order to get through all of those sets, you're going to leave a certain amount of reps in the tank to get higher quality on your later sets. You're going to pick lifts that are a little bit easier so you can get all of that volume in. Like, it just doesn't make any sense at all. I think when it comes to foundational principles, you want to pick your frequency and you want to pick your exercise selection first. From there, just do 3 sets. If you're doing one variation, do that twice a week and go from there. If it gets you growing consistently for a while and that slowly starts to fade away, you can add a little bit of volume. If you're starting to get beat up, then you're going to have to reduce your volume a little bit. So yeah, picking your volume first and reverse engineering your program from there doesn't make any sense. I would say it's more of an outcome. You want to start in a happy medium, and then it just gets individualized as you train based on the program that you're on and your own self. So that's all I've got for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. And yeah, if you want to participate in a future episode, give me a follow on the gram basement.bodybuilding, and I will see you guys in the next one.